Time of the gentleman has expired. He seeks recognition. What purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, much like payday lending and debt collection, the CFPB's work in indirect auto lending addresses decades of well-documented consumer abuses. This proposal would nullify a key component of the CFPB's auto lending regulatory regime and attempts to impose significant restrictions on the Bureau's ability to provide future indirect auto lending guidance. You know, I think the discussion on this subject by this committee is going in the wrong direction. This discussion, as my friend from Texas said, should be about how we eliminate discriminatory practices in the auto lending industry. How do we level the economic playing field? And how do we address the issue of income inequality? When you think about what has transpired over the last year, starting in my district in Ferguson with Michael Brown, it was a tragedy, yes. But then when you peel back what other issues are associated with that, the systemic causes, a lot of it has to do with income inequality. So how do people of color advance? It sure won't be by paying higher auto loans. It sure won't be by paying a higher interest rate over time. That doesn't give them a leg up. Historically, they've been discriminated against. Historically, they've had to pay more in interest rate. Why? Because of a poor credit score. Credit scores do not give you the history of a person's ability to pay on time. I know that. I know it because I was denied an auto loan at one time when I first started working. And I had to go to a credit union to get it. Guess what? I paid it back in half the time and they had to refund me money. But they denied me the loan initially because I didn't have a credit history. So how do people who are economically disadvantaged, how do they get a leg up? And that's what this discussion should be about. How do we help them? I don't know if this bill really addresses that. When you look at what we are trying to do, the empirical evidence is there, as my friend from Texas stated.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Before you came in, Mr. Clay, I was mentioning the various ways in which these communities are ripped off. And I talked about the private post-secondary schools, I talked about payday loans, I talked about car dealers, and I talked about banks with these mortgages. You mentioned Ferguson. There's another way that minority communities are ripped off. And I know a lot about Ferguson and St. Louis and Jennings and all those little towns because I was raised there. What did they find out, the Justice Department, when they investigated? That minorities were stopped by police officers and fined.
26 constitutional and illegal violations of the law by the Ferguson police.
By the Ferguson police. And as you drove through those little towns, if you were a minority, they stopped you, they wrote a ticket, and you went into the next town, they wrote another ticket. In the next town, they wrote another ticket.
And they treated the poor citizens of color as ATM machines.
Absolutely.
As ATM machines.
Another
to
example,
fund their government.
Another example of ripping off minorities, and they talk about wealth building. We'll never be able to build any wealth. We'll never be able to use the oftentimes low incomes that people have to try to have a decent quality of life as long as we allow public policy to do that. I yield time back to the gentleman.